On this episode of Supervision Simplified, we will be talking about different models of supervision, which ones we use, what we like about them, and we want to hear about the ones that you're using. Also, you will get to hear Valarie own her mistake and make a repair and tell you how much she really does love LPCs and give you a little more context for that conversation. Stay tuned.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Supervision Simplified. I'm Dr. Amy Parks.
I'm Valarie Harris.
And we're so excited to have you back with us today. And we want to start our show this week by talking a little bit about a conversation that we had a few weeks ago regarding the differences between different degree fields, between LPCs, LMFTs, MSWs, and, kind of all of the alphabet soup of the mental health field. And we were really...
Also known as the conversation where Valarie had an audio clip that appeared as though Valarie stuck her foot in her mouth. And so she's going to clarify some things for everyone listening.
Well, absolutely. And so, here's the point. We're really excited that so many people had so many thoughts about this particular conversation for a couple reasons. Number one, because we know that means you're listening. And number two, because we know that you are willing to be part of the conversation and to be part of the community. And those are two really, really top priorities for us. And so regardless of whether we agree or we agree to disagree or we completely disagree, we are all in this profession together, and in no way are we in a position to other one another or discount the value of one degree over another. So, Valarie, what did you want to say?
Yes. So first things first, if there's anyone in this dynamic duo to stick their foot in their mouth at any given time, it's going to be me. Hi, I'm her. And it's not intentional. Sometimes it's just, I'm a little bit, how do I say it? I have big energy, so I speak big. I use big words. I speak in like a lot of absolutes sometimes. And that's just the nature of who I am. And so there will be times where I will roll up and say something and be like, oh, oops, didn't think about that, didn't consider that. But I want to make sure that I'm being very, very clear, because even as an LPC myself, I am proud to be an LPC. I have no shame in that. I used to dig my heels in and joke with all the other professions that LPCs are so discounted and invalidated. And we were for a very long time. I don't even think it was recognized in California when I was going through school. It was only an LCSW or an LMFT. So there are times I've still talked to doctors' offices and they're like, are you even able to diagnose? And I'm like, LPCs were not created yesterday. Like, how do you not know this? So I am very proud to be an LPC. And when I was speaking, I want to speak very carefully and be very clear about what I was saying and what I wasn't saying. What I was saying is that in my little tiny area of life, when we have a lot of applicants coming in, it automatically, the MFT students and the MSW students, which really don't get a lot of MSW students because we don't have an LMSW or LCSW on staff currently. So that can sometimes interfere with supervision. But when we have a lot of applicants and we have to look at how much capacity we have, what our needs are as a practice, how quickly we can have them up and running, it is easier and has been easier every time to have an MFT student over the LPC student. One of those reasons being because they're trained in systems. That doesn't mean that not everyone is trained in systems if they're LPC. It means the universities that generally send students to us that are LPC, we find that we have to fill in those gaps. And because we have to fill in those gaps, it slows things down a little. The other part, which I did not speak to in that little small audio clip, is couples. We have a lot of need for couples, and a lot of LPCs have had one course in that and are often terrified, even if they have an interest in it, there's a lot that goes into preparing them and equipping them to be ready to see couples. Whereas somebody who's an MFT, they're ready to roll with that. So I was speaking in terms of like the capacity and how quickly I can get them up and running, and the joy I have with just having someone who has a strong systems theory on the team, because most of our team is LPC. So it's a diversity thing also. So if we have a ton of LPCs, having one MFT in the mix or an MSW in the mix can really make for rich conversations. It really adds a lot of value to our case conceptualization. It brings in, so that is all the context that came from that statement that you did
Mm-hmm.
not hear,
Right.
and that I was not clear on, that I want to make clear now, because that's really where all that was coming from.
So
But
there
I
was
am
a
really glad y'all were listening.
Right, and there was a lot
We
more to
didn't
that
spoke up.
conversation, yeah, than
Yeah.
just that one audio clip that was pulled for our PR. But I want to point out someone very kindly made the comment, and this was really, again, we appreciate all the comments and we try
Yes,
really
thank you
hard to
so
respond
much.
to them because again, we're really and we appreciate all of your messages and all of your input because we're really trying to start a conversation. We're really trying to build a
Mhm.
community here, and that's what this is about. And so we learn together, and a high tide raises all ships. And so
Yes.
let's keep the conversation going. But someone wrote us and said, so sad generalization is being used in this statement. There are many benefits in each category of study. Yes. Amen.
Absolutely.
You have a public voice. We're so excited that we have a public voice. As an LPC, I would never subscribe to something that doesn't recognize what my degree and license brings to the table. I wouldn't either.
No,
I
no, and
wouldn't
I will
either.
say as an LPC, some of that value that we bring to the table is we can diagnose much quicker. We can diagnose, which
Right,
I'm not always a fan of that, like, in theory, like, that's just my holistic trauma view, whatever, but we are more equipped to do that. We're less afraid of like substance abuse. Oftentimes, there's a lot of different things that I notice in the LPC realm that also bring a richness and a diverse perspective. It's just in my practice, that's the majority of what we have. So we get
right,
really excited when we see MFTs because I know they're going to bring that different perspective in, or if we see those MSWs and they're going to treat couples and it's going to have all the LPCs going, oh, that's a different way to look at that. But I
right.
did learn in the comments, which I was really excited about, that someone commented and said they had really good systems training, systems theory, and they came from a university also in Tennessee, not in my immediate area. So I was like, shout your university out. So anyone that did have really good systems theory training, please, especially if you're in Tennessee, like shout it out, comment, or any area really, because I want to know who is doing that and doing a really good job at that, versus just kind of touching on it in a class, because I think that's so important. And it's sort of like trauma it's the same way. Some universities are doing a far better job at requiring that people are trained in trauma and actually having a really good class in trauma theory, whereas a lot of others it's just an elective, or they just brush over it. Same with attachment. So that was not intended to be a broad stroke, although it was pulled for PR and it was one clip. It was not intended to be a broad stroke, and I agree that generalizations can be harmful, and that was not the intention. So, but thank you for speaking up and letting us know how you feel, and please keep doing that. It will never hurt our feelings, and I am always going to be the first to jump on and be happy to clarify and add context.
Absolutely. And I think I want to also add this one thing, and I think it speaks to both our training as clinicians and also sort of more broadly to our training as supervisors. And so I
Mhm.
think this kind of can make an interesting segue to our conversation today. And so, we have this K-CREP accrediting body that exists to tell universities sort of like how we want, you know, clinicians to be trained in at least in the counseling field, and the social work field has their own accrediting bodies, etc. So we have these big accrediting bodies that tell us how to do things, and then every university has the responsibility to sort of interpret that and turn that into their own course. So,
Okay.
they take the general idea that they're teaching counseling and theories practice, but they still have to pick the textbook. They still have to pick the professor. They still have to write the syllabus. They still have to meet all the objectives. And there's still a whole lot of parts of that that are out of the control of the big accrediting body, right? So it just depends on so many factors how you get trained. And then, so that's, I think, a big thing. And the same thing is true for supervisors, but actually significantly less less regulated, right?
Yeah.
So there
Right.
is no accrediting body nationally that says this is how supervisors should be trained. And so no one does it the same way as anyone else. No one has a framework of how things must be done. Now, again, I'm sorry to say this, but I'm going to say LMFTs are doing it right again,
I
even
agree.
though I'm an LPC, but because
Supervise the supervisor.
LMFTs, they only allow their supervisors to be trained by their in-house LMFT supervisors. LPCs should be doing it, and so should social workers. I'm an LPC. I believe in that. I'm going to die on that hill, and I will
I
continue to
agree,
say
and
that.
that's me as a supervisor who is now is working on the ACS through MBCC because I did not feel adequately prepared by just taking a lot of supervision trainings, and I 100% agree. Why would we, if we require so many hours of supervision for a license, why would we not require hours of supervision to supervise
Right.
someone getting a license? Like
So,
it
yes,
makes
we're
sense.
going to
It doesn't mean
continue.
there are not fantastic LPC supervisors out there. I'm just going to put it out there. I
Right.
had a great one. I also had an LCSW who was a fantastic supervisor. I work really hard to be a good supervisor. You do too. And yet, I believe that I, in the beginning, would have had a better foundation on which to grow from and engage with those first several students and master's level had I had a supervisor that I also reported to. I just think there would have been things that it's more of like the art of supervision, like the parallel processes, the not giving them the answers, more about, the just all the process pieces. The same things with clinical training. You go through you're clinically trained for the master's degree, but then when you come in to do internship and you're in and getting your supervision hours, you're learning the art of being a clinician and the engagement and then managing the processes and the transference and the counter transfer. It's more of the art of that and the nuanced pieces. And again, I think if we had to be supervised by supervisors, it would be fantastic. It would only help us. Wouldn't hurt us.
Exactly. Exactly. So I'm going to continue to beat that drum, and we will continue to have those conversations with all the people. And I'm going to continue to fight for it till the bitter end. All that being said, it means that, and here's the segue. It means that we already know that clinicians come to their work with varying levels of training, varying types
Mhm.
of training, varying classes and professors and expectations and objectives, all different lived experiences, bias, all the things. And the
Mhm.
same thing is true for supervisors. They're coming at supervision with all of those different things, different lived experience, bias, training, experiences, and then on top of it, their own experiences as a clinician. So all
Mhm.
that being said, that sort of like where I want to lead us today in our conversation is around the idea of supervision styles, because I do believe that if you have gone through a doctoral program in counselor education and supervision, you are sort of channeled. I don't want to say the word push. I think you are gently sort of channeled into a style that feels organic for you, and that aligns with, sort of like we do in counseling training, like kind of aligns with how you work. And you're
Mhm.
taught, you learn that style, and that's sort of how you operate. If you have not gone through a counselor education and supervision doctoral program, as neither of us have, and many of our colleagues have not, then you kind of learn somewhat organically what style works for you. And maybe you've read, like a bunch of books, right? And maybe you have taken training because your state requires it. Maybe you haven't. Um, but I want to have a conversation about supervision styles, because there are some very structured supervision strategies and styles that exist in the world. And then there are just some ways that you can kind of put it all together and just wing it. So
Mm-hmm.
I just kind of wanted to kind of think about what your style was today, Valarie, and kind of see
Woo.
if we could sort of unpack that a little bit.
Yeah. So, I mean, I feel like I would have thought for a while that I leaned a little more towards a developmental model in general, but um as I was looking at it when I went through this process as part of the ACS, I actually realized that I do this team model that I had not heard of before in any of my other trainings. Um, and it basically just has these four sequential stages, which is teach, evaluate, assure, and mentor. And so in the teaching phase, I mean, it's looking at a lot of like gatekeeping, obviously in that teaching stage. And then looking at, so you could think of like skills checks, things of that sort. But then also then there's the evaluation piece of it, which, can look at different assessments. It could be client-based assessments. It could be assessments of the supervisee, getting to know them, letting them get to know one another. And so that's more like orienting them a little bit to the process. And then let's see here, and also doing like an evaluation of that clinical work. But what's neat is in between every single stage of team, it's like there's a gatekeeping that goes in between each one. So like the gatekeeping sort of like just shifts based on whatever stage that you're in. And then when you get to the assure, that's more of like that direct supervision. So maybe it could be those, I think, supervision sessions, but also could be watching, say, a tape session with them, and actually directly supervising them through that, or co-treatment. And then the mentor is more of like supporting that independent practice. So I think of my people who are closest to getting their license, like it feels a lot more like coaching at this point, and it feels a little less directive because they've already been with me doing supervision for like 2+ years now. And so now it's a lot of them really directing it and me just sort of doing a lot more of a supportive role. But that was new to me because, like I said, I had not heard of that. And I thought, oh, well, that's something I naturally do. And
Mm-hmm.
I think for me, it just made sense because, again, I think I'm an educator at heart. And I learned pretty early on as a supervisor that I had a distortion of competence and made a lot of assumptions that they were ready to do certain things that they weren't. And I had forgotten how I acquired that knowledge and learned to do that. And so now I kind of go in with the mindset of like, they need to be taught how to do clinical care, they need to be taught how to do all parts of that. They understand theory, it's my job to teach them practice. So
Yeah,
I
that's an
really
excellent.
subscribe to, yeah, I think that's more of like, in terms of like a model, that makes it's less of a theory and more of like the vehicle, I guess you could
Yeah.
say, and how you do it. So I guess it would still go with developmental. Um, but then yeah, what are your thoughts?
Well,
Had you heard of that model?
I'm grabbing a piece of paper because you said something so good. I want to make a note of it because I want to
Oh,
just tag it in our, because that idea of clinicians come to us knowing the theory, and our job is to teach them the practice. I think that that's such a valuable, that quote is so good. So yeah, I've heard of. I think that there's a lot of different kinds of models, and I not I mostly use a developmental model similar to you. I
mhm.
didn't really realize there was a team kind of model.
Same,
So
I know.
I don't really know if I would know what that is separate from what we already do. So I think that that's kind of interesting. But can you speak more to the gatekeeping part? Because now I'm kind of thinking it's sort of similar to how we run internship.
That's what it kind of felt like. It honestly really did feel like that. So, it's basically, let's see here. So, it's more or less like, and this is where it makes me think a little bit of the developmental model. So, it says that, supervising should be showing observable progress, a working knowledge of key components of counseling competence in the process and performance at the beginning professional level. So, essentially, it's more or less like until you want to make sure that the gatekeeping checks out for whatever model they're at. So that's why I think of like skills checks. For us, being a trauma focused practice, we're developing skills checks so that there are going to be certain skills checks that they would need to pass in that teach model, that or that teach stage of things, so that we understand that they can disseminate that knowledge. So they need to know how to, for instance, demonstrate that they can talk about the attachment styles, or they can talk about the nervous system for us, and how trauma disrupts the nervous system, and what's happening in the brain, because that's a key component for us in doing our work, is that those who are with us are going to be leaning in that trauma lens. So trauma and attachment is a must for us. But it could also be things like, let's say for an intake, an intentional intake, we have skills checks around that. So, do they know the valuable things to go over in that intake? Are they stating them? Are they setting the frequency of treatment? Are they explaining the process of counseling? We each have our own little statements about what that may look like. Like I will say things like, "You should never feel like I'm shoving you through this, or that I'm dragging you. That you might feel me nudge a little, or you might feel me tug, but it should never feel like I'm shoving you or I'm dragging you. This should feel like I'm beside you, and occasionally may nudge or pull." So it's that idea of this is a collaborative process where we're doing this together. Um, Another skills check could be something like asking, how did they determine the treatment goals? So one of the questions I ask for a new client might be, how would you know if counseling was working for you? What would be different? And based on what they may report back, that could be the personalized statement that then becomes a treatment goal. So, not that everyone in our practice has to use those same lines of questioning, but can they arrive at the same place? Because again, the practice of counseling is you need to know how to recommend frequency. We find that a lot of people that come straight out of school end up doing this. So when do you want to come back? And I'm like, no, no, no.
Right.
You're the expert on the process. They
Right.
are the expert on their experience and their story. So they're
I find
looking
that
to
true too.
you to make the recommendation. Well, what if they can't do weekly? Well, that's okay. You still make the clinical recommendation because it's the recommendation. And then you let them know, if you can't do weekly, that's okay. Here's why we like to ask that. Things may move a little slower, but you can still
Right.
get where you need to go.
Sure.
So I think of like a skills check there. So the evaluate and the skills check after that would be looking at their actual clinical skills. It could be things like attunement or pacing, or how did you decide that frequency? What determined that for you? How did you decide that diagnosis? Did you ask about substance abuse? Did you get a list of meds? I mean, again, skills checks around different things. Um, and then I think, so that's kind of what I think of. Is that making sense? Sort of
Yeah,
like we're not going
absolutely.
to go to the next place until we've checked these things.
Can you tell me, where did you reference this? What material are you pulling this team
Yes.
source from? Clinical Supervision in the Helping Professions, a Practical Guide. Cool.
Yes, this is produced by the ACA and good old Gerald Corey. Shout out Gerald Corey. If you ever want to come on our podcast, we'd love to have you, because I've read like 500 of your books, and I'm just so impressed that your name is still on all the books.
Yeah, we can definitely call him and ask him.
Although one day I really want to have my name on a book, and
Yes.
maybe it could be with yours. I don't know,
Yes, we
but
will.
I mean,
On
like,
such
this
a
is like
supervision.
20 plus years in the field, and dude's name is still on all the books, Gerald. Like, come talk to us. I want to know you. I have such curiosity about you. Um,
Yes. Let's
and
invite him. And
and your
yes,
impact.
and we are
Yes.
hoping to have
So this is the one
a
they use for the ACS course with the MBCC
okay. Hopefully, we
for the
will have
certification.
a more like a desktop companion through PESI that's coming out in the spring. So we'll have our names on that,
Yes.
and that will be great. One of the things, though, that I think is really curious and interesting is that feel like the supervisors that I meet and work with oftentimes are doing this sort of like responding and reactive dance with their
Yes.
supervisee rather than a teaching and training like proactive strategy, which is what I'm hearing this team approach is really more about thinking ahead about like here's what the skills check is going to look like.
Yes, like
Here's
a scaffolding.
right, exactly. And I actually think that my supervisees would freak out if they thought that that was coming. But I think that that is such a valuable strategy towards, it doesn't have to be like a course or a formalized set of metrics, but I do think
Mhm.
it's a really valuable, it's very similar to how we run internship, which is these are the skills that we expect you to have attained in practicum. This is how we expect you to be able to pass through internship one and internship, and so why are we not all doing that? Again, it's up for grabs. But what
Well,
I
one,
will
I haven't
say,
put it all together in a package to sell it just yet. So one of these days.
right,
But I will say I find that it gives them a lot of relief because what I notice is that they come in, they sit with whether they're a student or a new hire, they still immediately sit and shadow with our other therapists just to start getting connected with our population, to kind of get an idea of the workflow day to day and just start getting comfortable. And if they're a new therapist and they've recently graduated, it never fails that there's this like deer in headlight look at some point during that observation process of I don't know if I can do this. And either
right,
it's they're feeling very out of their window of tolerance, like they're like, I'm so tired. I just sat in like 3 sessions today, but I'm exhausted. And I'm like, that's you at the edges of your window of tolerance. So it's either they're not prepared for like the impact of that sitting in the room with people in such pain, or they're seeing the different ways of engaging in these well-developed relationships and they're going like, oh no. Or they're having a person who's going to be their client who's older than them and they're feeling a little intimidated by that. So I find it just gives them this sense of relief for me to go, well, why wouldn't you feel that way? Like you just started.
mm-hmm,
Like I
mm-hmm,
would feel I
right,
would feel a lot differently if you were like overly confident and felt like there were no issues. The fact that you're feeling a little bit hesitant tells me that you are 100% aware of what's at stake in your role and the value of that and the power of that. And it tells me how much you really want to do this and you want to do it well. And here's the great news: we're not going to expect you to be where that person is tomorrow. We have a step, like a little incremental process that we're going to have you go through. And then they're like, oh, thank goodness. I
right,
don't have to learn everything at once. I can just take and focus right here on understanding the way the nervous system works, finding my voice and explaining that to a client, getting comfortable role playing that in supervision, or going to another clinician and saying, how do you say that to a client? How do you
right.
explain that? And then they start getting a little bit of self-efficacy in the process of that.
Right. And then that helps build their confidence. I always find it
Mhm.
to be a big red flag when a supervisee is like, oh, I don't really have any cases to consult on. I'm like,
Oh
what? What? Like, what are you
yeah.
talking about? You don't have anything to talk about. One of the things in this kind of older book by published by Wiley, and it's Kaufman and Kaufman, who are probably still out there in the world, and did a lot of editing and book writing back in the day for us in textbooks, is this idea, this sort of theory of this interpersonal process recall, which is, really kind of along the lines of the idea of when a supervisee's thoughts and feelings on their relationship with clients
Mhm.
means that they approach the topic of the supervision with some kind of bias. And
Mhm. Oh,
so, this idea is that their anxiety responses, so like their fear of being engulfed by the client's needs or the demands to be omnipotent, interfere with building an effective and ethical relationship with the client. And
yeah. Mhm.
so, um, you know, this talks about it's really interesting. This whole sort of section here talks about the idea that the primary means for this kind of intervention. So what could happen is oftentimes when a supervisor, and I don't know if this has happened to you, but when you sort of, as a supervisor, point out in whatever way you can gently to a supervisee that these things might be occurring,
Mhm.
oftentimes a supervisee can become defensive and
Yeah.
concerned that they're maybe not functioning at the in the ways that they're expected to be functioning. And so one of the things, and we've talked about this before, but one of the things that this model particularly talks about is that really the best way to move through that is through this means that you're speaking of the kind of evaluative sort of audio videotaping
Yeah.
skills checking where the individual can say it can be a reflection activity and say, okay, well, let's watch this together and see if there's anything that you pick up on that maybe I'm missing. Maybe I'm overreacting or overstepping and I'm seeing something that doesn't exist. Or maybe
Mhm.
when you see it and you watch yourself in practice, you will observe that. And so I know so many people, and I'm one of them. Very much early in my career as a supervisor, I was really just winging it. I don't feel like I had training, but I don't feel like I was doing supervision with the level of fidelity that I feel like I have now, which is,
Right.
I guess, bad and also good at the same time because we all learn and grow, right? Um, but I love this idea of like saying, okay, well, maybe I'm not catching something, and let's just do
Yes.
the skills check. And it doesn't have to be gatekeeping. It doesn't have to say you're not moving
Mm.
on. It just means that this is an area where you have an opportunity for growth.
Yeah, but it also makes it so much easier to have your clinicians' backs and to understand them as supervisees and to know their strengths so I think it's one of those things where it helps everyone. Like it's good for
Mhm.
them to see too because without that process, so often their narrative of how well they're doing is usually way off from how they're actually doing. And I find that those that are the most resistant to being monitored or seen are the ones who generally have the most to learn and need the most from a growth perspective. And I would say, as a supervisor, like I think just like leaders go first, I think supervisors go first. So, I mean, there are times I'll ask someone if I can record a session. There are times I'll throw myself out in the middle of a treatment team meeting and say, hey, can I pull one of you to do this intervention? I may have not done that intervention in like, I don't know, 2 or 3 years. I may be like winging it that moment, but I also am okay to do that. And I want it to be uncomfortable for me because it helps me remember what I'm asking them to do. And if I can step into that and even maybe flub on it or like, I think I did an intervention a couple weeks ago in my camera, like the card was full and it cut off halfway. And I was like, oh my gosh. But aside from that, um, not only just that, and I was doing it with a supervisee, but she took far longer to get to the end of that intervention than I was planning for, and I was like, "Dang, she gave me a run for my money," and I don't think she did it on purpose. It
Right.
was just her process. She was very
Yeah.
authentic in it, but I didn't see that coming, so I got to process that in supervision with the supervisees at a different time and go, "I didn't anticipate it was gonna go that long. I Usually with clients it goes like this, but she was so well resourced it took longer for her to drop down and move." So it's good and humbling, and they get to see too that I don't have it all together, and that's never the goal. It's just to make these really intentional decisions.
Hmm.
And kind of like you said, that interpersonal process, we talk about the triangle a lot, just the the Kaufman triangle, the drama triangle, trauma triangle. So we have a saying around our practice where I'm like, is that yours or is that mine or is it ours or is that
Mm-hmm.
theirs? Like,
Mm-hmm.
where are you in the triangle? And so we try to cope ahead and plan ahead. So it's instead of waiting till they're in it, we just say, hey, you work with trauma, you're going to be in somebody's triangle at some point. Your job is to be on the outside as the observer and the coach, but I guarantee you at some point you're going to feel like the victim, you're going to be the rescuer, or you're going to want to be the persecutor. So even having them just close their eyes and imagining what it might feel like as a persecutor and feeling that in their body versus being a rescuer or a victim can help them then attune with that in the room with a client when that comes up. So that when they get in supervision, it's, oh, I think I'm moving into this role. I don't even have to say it. They're already aware because we've already told them it's not if, but when.
Mm-hmm.
But in the past, there were some really
I
defensive people, and I feel like the really defensive ones were the ones that may have just not known it was coming, and so it felt personal. And I was like, "Oh, maybe if I did." So that's why from that point on, I've just thought, maybe if we just educate them that it's a thing and it's gonna happen, and their job is to catch when it happens because it happens to everyone, then it never feels personal.
Right, exactly. And I also agree that I think that thinking about the idea that we as supervisors need to be vulnerable with our supervisees, not necessarily because we're trying to show weakness, but because we're trying to demonstrate that we're always learning and we're always growing. And so this idea that there are a variety of supervision models, we don't know them all. We're sort of trying new ones out. We want to talk with our audience about what supervision models they use. Tell us in the comments what you use. Let's talk more about that because I think it's really a very, very interesting topic. And I'd like to continue to have this conversation around these supervision models and see where it takes us. Thanks so much, Valarie, for sharing all of that
Yeah.
and all of that information that you're getting from this really great book and from your work. And thank you all for tuning into this episode of Supervision Simplified today. Remember that the revolution starts here. We hope you'll subscribe to Supervision Simplified and that you'll share it with your friends and colleagues. We also want your comments, stories, and feedback so we can be sure to be talking about all the things that interest you the most. Until the next time, thanks again for joining us, and we'll see you again soon.
Bye.